What a terrible time to hit the record button. This is the first of, I'm tentatively thinking of calling it Be Kind Review instead of Be Kind Rewind. I'm old. What am I doing? I'm reviewing. Anytime somebody puts out something written about pro wrestling that winds up on Georgia Wrestling History, I'm going to try to review it. And I'm going to slowly, methodically go through the various sort of like video blogs and podcasts pertaining to wrestling, particularly that emanate from Georgia and or the rest of the Southeast. A lot of people contact me who have wrestling podcasts. I have to admit I don't listen to many. Some I follow once in a while on the national scene. I'll listen to them, and most of them I hate. I just have to be honest. But I think I owe it to people. People are listening to my stuff, watching my stuff, reading my stuff. I want to encourage that behavior, so I'm going to do a quick review. This one's going to be, I'm going to hit a bunch of things very quickly. I'm going to try to not let this thing go on too long because I have a lot to review. Because I did a review of one of Drew Blood's first things once I started doing videos. I did a thing about Logan Chase. So I wanted to cover everything that's been out since then. So I'm just going to have to kind of like be a skipping stone on most of them. My apologies, but my hope is that this becomes kind of a weekly thing and I keep up with it a little better. I mean, we're going to cover everyone from John Johnson's thing, about the 4 guys who went into the Anarchy Hall of Fame. We're going to cover Logan Chase's second article. The first one he wrote about how like managers have been devalued in wrestling. This one is holding managers to account a little. And then 3 by Drew Blood. It shows you how long it's been since I've done this, so I wanted to kind of catch up. And part of that is looking at Drew Blood's stuff. And the Chase Stevens article, which has gotten a lot of attention about basically how the hard physicality of training and getting your ass beat in wrestling is actually good for you. And then I'm going to look at the 60 Minute Broadway, Gunnar Miller's, I'm going to call it a podcast. It's a video thing. He had Gary Lamb on. I thought I would close by looking at that. And again, are these my opinions? Duh, of course they are. I'm going to put a link to the written things in the description. So if you want to go check them out, you're more than welcome to. As for 60 Minute Broadway, hell, you can find that thing very easily. Again, you're looking for Gunnar Miller, 60 Minute Broadway, and you can find it. This one with Gary Lamb apparently was going to be the first one that they're going to put on YouTube. Great. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to work chronologically backwards, the one that's the farthest away. Which is Logan Chase's A View from Ringside. In his first one, I did sort of an extensive review of it. I liked many parts of it, but I thought some parts were a little cursory. This one I thought was much more thorough, and that makes sense because in this one, Logan Chase is holding managers to account. They've got to be good, they've got to study their craft, all this stuff. There's not a lot to disagree with in any of it. I like the general premise. The one thing is that I find interesting is if these are indeed different times, who are the managers that are putting stuff out in a public way in order to get their brand and the brand of the people they are in charge of out there? Again, these are promotions in Georgia that do not have television. So how are the managers putting it out there? Frankly, I see a little bit of stuff from Doc Brock, but I see most of the stuff, almost all of the stuff is Matt Hankins. That's the guy who you see out there. That's the guy who's making his own videos. That's the guy that's talking up his guys. That's the guy who's talking up himself and making his stuff interesting. So if it's true, and I agree with Logan Chase, that managers have to take themselves into account and hold themselves to the standard, where's the work being put in by managers? I think in this day and age, simply walking your guy out to the ring and cutting a promo in the ring is not sufficient. I think if managers want to be relevant, then they have to make themselves relevant, and part of that relevance is social media platforms because there's no television on which to do it. Shooter's Alley, John Johnson. We've had him on Tipping Point semi recently, talking about the Hall of Fame inductees. Again, another one. There's really nothing to debate. He kind of goes into the four guys: Tank, Iceberg, not in this order. I think he went Iceberg, Jeff G. Bailey, Dan Wilson, and Tank. And he had a sort of a personal story about each one. Again, really great stuff. You should click the link. You should read it. I think he really did those guys a service. And if it's true that John Johnson's going to get into writing stuff, I hope he continues to do so. My one advice to people who write is continue to do it. We've had a lot of people in Georgia wrestling who were all gung-ho about they were going to write this thing, right? Charles was going to like Tales from the Toilet or whatever, and he was going to write this stuff, and he was going to put out a book, and writing is really hard, right? I remember Josh Wheeler. I was excited about his thing where he was going to write this stuff constantly, but all these guys kind of quit on it. Continue to write, gentlemen and ladies. I would love to see a female perspective on wrestling in the state, and that to continue to come out. Yeah, Alicia Stockton used to do show reviews, but she's sort of like, she doesn't do them anymore. I don't know if she's not going to wrestling. I suspect that's a lot of what it is. Her interests lie elsewhere. Still, it's always great to see people talking. We're getting more show reviews, which is phenomenal. But yeah, Logan Chase. His thing is great. I want to see who's going to step up besides Hankins, because right now Hankins is the runaway manager of the year. I don't know who even a close second is. So we'll see. Drew Blood. He's got 3. Yeah, we're going to start from the one that was the farthest away from now. The horror. And it's a lot of it's Drew talking about his sort of feelings about WrestleMania, which were shit. I don't like it. I don't like anything that's going on in wrestling. I'm kind of, I say I love wrestling, but then I don't really love wrestling. A lot of what Drew writes about, I'm shocked to say I completely understand where he's coming from, and they mirror a lot of my feelings, right? They do mirror a lot of my feelings about wrestling. The one sort of fallacy I always see in Drew's stuff, though, is he's never applies that magnifying lens to himself or to promotions that he works for, which I find really interesting. And that kind of goes into his thing about comedy and wrestling. Again, with his generalities and his sort of like big statements about it, I completely agree with. I like the analysis. I like that he's right, that comedy should naturally present itself in the situation instead of being forced in. But I gotta say this, when I read a review of a Southern Fried show, I find the comedy that he's doing with Drew, I like the lightsaber shit, and and then his jokes about like live long and prosper. Oh, that's Star Trek, not Star Wars. Is that shit funny? I guess the argument would be, well, you weren't there, you didn't see it. It got a big pop from the crowd, but nothing about that seems funny to me. What I'm saying is, can comedy be done in wrestling? Of course, I agree with Drew, and I agree with his assessment that it should arise naturally from situations and not be forced in. But then, if the definition is all of success is always, but the crowd thought it was funny, well, yeah, and to a lot of people, like, shit obvious comedy is funny, right? Like he brings up a point about like movies about gags don't last. Yeah, but then so who's doing funny stuff in wrestling that's groundbreaking or changing? Or there's gag stuff, and then there's when like Chris Rock when it was in his prime, and he would tell a joke and you felt like you were being enlightened, right? The best comedy highlights something. That's the only part about discussions of comedy and wrestling that I thought was kind of missing, was comedy can be transgressive, right? Like, it sounds crazy to say, but like the Degeneration X stuff, though it wasn't that funny to me necessarily, I can't deny its impact, right? I mean, it felt dangerous because it was breaking wrestling taboos and breaking company taboos. You know, we're gonna show up at WCW and blow up this building. Is it brilliant? Not necessarily, but it's certainly groundbreaking. And that's something that Drew Blood stayed away from, and I could see why, because neither he nor anybody else is doing anything comedically in wrestling that could be considered truly amazing, right? If I see a pro wrestling guerrilla thing where they like throw the invisible grenade and everybody goes, like, I may not like it. I may think that that's disrupting the idea of pro wrestling or whatever, but I can't deny that there isn't something sort of engaging and interesting about it. Now, they don't take it anywhere else, which is my ultimate fault with it. But who's doing something that's truly interesting, truly that really highlights something that engages you? And most importantly, if heels are funny, isn't their humor obligated to cut deep enough to the audience that when they get their comeuppance, that it's satisfying on another level? That's what I try to do when I did, because I was the lethal litigator back in the day. I was a wrestling lawyer, and I got my ass beat, but not before I would cut a promo or do a skit or do something that wasn't cutting. Yeah, even when we had our feud against Anarchy, that they didn't really hold up their end on, but the comedy stuff I did was funny, yes, and it was also brutal. It's whether it was me talking to my child and then her going like, oh, but you know, you just wore a mask? Who would be so dumb that they wouldn't get that? But that was me going like, yeah, that audience was so dumb that they didn't realize it was me under the mask. Aren't they idiots, right? When I did the like Tom Sawyer Huckleberry Finn thing with Miss Rachel, that was sort of like a cutting insult of the fans of Cornelia. And there was an element of truth in it that made it not only very funny, but also very heelish, right? Where I deserve to get punished. Anyway, see, the article is engaging enough that it elicits a discussion. It's worth reading. And then finally, Drew Blood's analysis of the crowds in wrestling and Gary Lamb's thing. Again, I think he's spot on about so much of it when he speaks in sort of the general historical stuff. Yeah, there was a time where crowds in the States and the surrounding areas were much bigger, and that, you know, 1,000 that Gary Lamb drew. I do think the 1,000 thing with Gary Lamb is very funny because people always go like, yeah, they did it, and that's impressive enough, but. And Drew Blood and Gary Lamb are definitely scrapping, and Drew Blood definitely, his bias is all over this thing, right? Because again, he's a Southern Fried guy, and does Southern Fried, does it not, do all these criticisms not apply to Southern Fried? David Manders is not a wrestling guy, and David Manders makes mistakes and all of that. And again, I would be interested in Drew Blood doing a true, because everything Drew Blood writes, like when he writes about comedy and wrestling, he always talks about like, and here's how I did it, and here's how it was great. But I don't know how powerful of a magnifying lens he turns on himself. And I would be most interested to hear, because early on he showed signs that he was going to do that, but then he said, like Todd and others basically told him, don't do that or the boys will hate you. To which I say, what's the true value of analysis if you can't analyze yourself and the groups that you're with? You're just a guy pissing out instead of pissing in, which has a value. I love that Drew writes a regular thing, and that he writes when he feels inspired. But I would imagine a true self-analysis and analysis of Southern Fried in context of the guys that he works with, and the guys that he sees most often would be the most valuable. And it says something about wrestling that he feels like he can't do that or he shouldn't do that. On to, let's do Chase Stevens. This article's got a lot of attention, and here's some quotes from it that I thought were really interesting. Because of those ass beatings, meaning him getting beat down during training, I respect the business side of wrestling today. I think that's a common refrain, not just from wrestling, but from society at large. I got beat when I was a kid, and it taught me respect, and ergo, the kids nowadays need to get spanked more often than they would have respect too. There's lots of things about traditional pro wrestling I adore and I like. And one day for Platinum Story Time, I'm going to tell the story of the one time that I shot on somebody in training ever. Right? I think, in light of like that shoot brainbuster thing and all this other stuff, I agree with Chase Stevens in that when he says a lot of people have zero athletic ability that get involved in wrestling. And if I said, look at the people around Georgia wrestling who have the loudest voices, determine which ones have zero athletic ability. You can probably think of a few names, but it's probably names that you let slide. That's interesting, isn't it? This quote. In other words, that quote of because of those ass beatings, I respect the business side of wrestling today. There's something called like Kohlberg's morality pyramid, and at the bottom is fear of punishment, and that's the basis of morality. But it's not it's not what you're supposed to attain. It's not what you're supposed to aspire to attain. That's just the first level. And my contention is that pro wrestling never gets past like the first 2 or 3 stages. Like fear of punishment, want of reward, right? The good boy face, in other words, that people say good things about you. Then there's the law and order people. There's rules in pro wrestling, and you need to follow them, and kayfabe, and blah 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 blah. But you're supposed to be trying to attain the higher stuff, right? The two highest being, the very highest being doing things for the principles of being right. And I very rarely hear people talk about that. They just seem more concerned with rules and, people need their ass beat. And, it's never... rare is the locker room that I've been in where I've heard them talk about aspiring to do something greater for its own sake. And again, it's easy for me to talk about myself and Platinum Championship Wrestling, so that's what I'm going to do. But, our motto was saving the art of pro wrestling one match at a time. And, in the documentary The Booker, one of my favorite quotes when I looked back on that and saw myself was when I was like, and this is during a locker room speech with the guys, I was like, we're in a business where the people, where they hate themselves, where we hate ourselves. Wrestling fans hate the fact that they're wrestling fans on some level and that they act out on pro wrestling. Pro wrestlers themselves kind of hate the business that they're in at the same time that they kind of love it, right? We're in a business where everybody hates themselves, and we're going to teach them to love themselves. I mean, pretty lofty goals, right? And did we always get there? Of course not. But I was shooting up here. It wasn't just, if you fuck up, I'm going to beat your ass, or I won't book you again. I mean, that, like, all the guys that are just operating on that lower level, man. There's just something not great about that. And that's the only thing that concerned me about the Chase Stevens article, is everything was about the lowest levels of the morality pyramid, I like this line: the fans pay to see larger-than-life men and women working hard in an art form in the ring. Again, it seems like it's aspiring for more. And I think to an extent, on the surface, what he's saying is absolutely true, but the reality is something else indeed. I don't think we live in a time. I think we live in a time which is equal parts larger than life. We want our celebrities to be larger than life, but we also want them to be enough like us that we feel like we were responsible for elevating them. Hence the rise of the Instagram star, right? The real interesting thing about the Instagram model phenomenon is that they're literally the girl next door. That you're almost special by not being special. That in the age of American Idol, that it's, the waitress in your favorite bar, maybe she's got a good enough voice that she can become famous. There's also that appeal. There is the appeal of, you know what? That's a dude who's just like me. I mean, how many of the guys nowadays, the wrestlers that inspire the modern generation probably have zero resemblance to the wrestlers that inspired mine, and so on and so forth as you go down the line. Something interesting to keep in mind. Chase Stevens' close. Learn the craft, get trained correctly, and protect yourself at all times. I totally agree. Though that protect yourself at all times thing, that's a fighting thing. Pro wrestling is different. You have to trust somebody else with your body. You can't do both at once, which is why stuff like giving your body to somebody and them taking advantage of it and hurting you, to me, is an egregious crime that should be called out all the time in pro wrestling under every circumstance. And pro wrestling has failed to do that. And I think it needs to change and call those things out and call them what they are, which is a violation of wrestling's sacred trust. That's a high principle. 60-Minute Broadway. God, I'm already past 20 minutes, so I won't go into it too much. I will say this, it started off very slow, not just because of the technical errors, but boring as fuck. Gary Lamb, what I was afraid of was the 60-Minute Broadway was going to be nothing but a mutual admiration society betwixt Gunnar Miller and Gary Lamb, and there was a lot of that. But once they kind of got into it a little more, it was definitely more interesting. When they're sort of half-assed attempts at going at people, be it GPW or whatever else, I thought those things didn't deliver as well. The two things I thought didn't deliver were, I don't think they went deep enough into the phenomenon of people don't like Gary Lamb. Like everything's always chalked up to, oh, they're haters and they can't keep up and so they hate. I think that's overly simple. And again, Gary Lamb, who I think is an incredibly smart guy, Gunnar Miller is an incredibly smart guy. The one thing they both have trouble doing is turning that magnifying lens on themselves. Gary, perhaps because he thinks it's a sign of weakness if he admits fault, or that he can talk about in generalities. I've failed before and I've failed again, but I'm going to use that to propel myself to success. And Gunnar Miller, who just goes like, well, wrestling people are shit and these different wrestling groups are shit and I know more. Guess what? Every one of the wrestlers always thinks they know more, but I want to hear. Again, it's a very male thing, American male thing of like projecting strength at all times. And what it does is I think that it cuts out a bunch of things that would be far more interesting. I would love to see 60-Minute Broadway, which, by the way, just in terms of the look of it, the production, the interaction with their producer and all that stuff, I thought all that stuff worked. Will I ever watch 60-Minute Broadway again? I'll watch the one that mentioned me, most certainly, and I think I will continue to watch it here and there if I find the guest interesting enough. I think Gunnar Miller will get better at developing the personality for this. I love that he's doing it, but I want him to ask himself the question, why should people listen to this shit? And the answer is ultimately him. And part of that is this routine of I know everything in the fucking world. I don't think it holds water, and I think it's more interesting if he was more honest with himself and subsequently his audience. And for Gary Lamb, I know Gary Lamb has always said that, like, I'm never going to be the one of two people on a podcast again. I'm always going to I have to be the guy, and blah, 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 blah. But my God, I don't know how many more times I can hear the sort of same kind of routines and stories. I thought it was interesting when he and Gunnar were sort of exchanging information. This is a guy that I read or watch that you should get into too, and why, etc., etc., etc. But you can't help but when you're watching the thing, or at least when I watch it, I always just think like, man, they're almost setting themselves up for a fall. I just get that feeling because I've seen similar things many times before of guys sort of like glad handing themselves, and their analysis seems limited to the faults of others and not what they're going to do to learn. Everything seems about like, here I'm a tree of wisdom, and is my guest. Everybody come enjoy our wisdom. Ironic, I know, coming from me, but it is what it is. Anyway, that's my first edition. Go check these things out, and I'll have another one of these up real soon. And tomorrow, my goal is to have the next full disclosure news and commentary. Let's get it.